So the continued capacity of the soil to function, that's the key to soil health, and really it's what we all want the soil to do. We assume that the soil is going to function every day. We assume that when we run the pivot around that the water is actually going to soak in. That's a function of the soil, and we can impact that with our management practices. How fast that happens is what we're going to test with these infiltration rate kits. But there's a lot of other soil functions: nutrient cycling, permeability for air exchange so that we have efficient nutrient cycling, and stability. We really want our crops to stay standing, and we would really like it to not head on down the creek. So stability is another function, and biological habitat is a really important function. It's kind of an accumulation of all of the other soil functions, is the ability for things to live there. They need air, water, food, space, and shelter, which is all of the things that we just talked about in the other functions. This is soil from Rogers Memorial Farm. I brought it with me last year, and I take it everywhere I go. I don't travel light these days. These are shelf-stable monoliths. They're glued, but it shows working land soil, and it's a comparison study between 40 years of tillage and 40 years of no tillage. And the whole field started off looking like this 40 years ago. It all had these bands of compaction in it, and the reason I know that is this is 11 years of no-till and cover crops, and it's kind of good, bad, and on the way. This is a little different. It's the halfway between the two of these. This is a lot darker. There's a lot more soil structure. The roots go clear to the bottom of the profile, really straight down instead of on lateral, through cracks and crevices. And this has a little bit of soil structure issue off to the side, away from the crop rows. This is a controlled traffic system. So the corn's planted here, and 2 inches over are the soybeans every year. They move 2 inches over. And so the tire tracks are always in the same row, and this is a non-tire traffic row. The roots have impacted this in between row space next to where the crops are growing. No cover crops on this, just no-till. And this really proves that just a good set of no-till, good farming practices can result in positive structure and good soil health. And it didn't take cover crops. And so we can do this, it just takes time. And that's all of our soil management practices take time to accomplish. These soils down here are from that same field. They're the same soil type. And I'll try and hunt through here for some examples of the long-term till field is here, and the long-term no-till is here. And you can kind of see that the glue makes a wet soil color, but this is the dry, unglued kind of color, a little bit more tan, maybe more gray. Dry colors are different than wet colors, and so when we color soil, we always moisten it so that we get the wet soil color. These two dirt clods are stable when dry, thank you. But we really care how stable they are when they're wet. And wet stability is a really important soil function, and it doesn't just happen by accident. It really takes things living there to create stability. They don't want their homes to shift or melt or blow away, and so they invest in the stability of the soil structure around where they live. An earthworm has a goo. They're sticky and gooey when you pick them up. That goo is an exudate that soaks into the soil around it. When that exudate dries, the soil around that channel actually hardens and becomes stable, and that exudate creates stability when that soil's wet. So that's like the biggest example of an organism in the soil that has an exudate. Roots have that, bacteria have that, fungus have that. They're all stabilizing the soil around them. So as we put more living things in the soil, the stability increases. This has hardly anything living in it, and so it's only stable when dry. So when we put this in water for the first time, there's a really big amount of pressure change. As the water soaks into the soil, we get kind of an explosion or exceeding the capacity of the soil to stay stable. And so we get slaking. That's called the slake test. Slake is kind of a slipping or an explosion of soil. And this soil is stable when wet because, like I said, those critters that are living there, they don't want their home to shift or melt or blow away. So they really invest in the mortar between the bricks. They're constantly replacing that mortar because the mortar is actually edible. Their exudates are highly edible. It's a sugar that soaks into the soil around them, and that's a edible food for plant roots. It's an edible food for bacteria and fungus, and that's the start of a lot of nutrient cycling, is root exudates and other exudates from organisms. So they have to constantly replace the mortar between the bricks, and that's why it's important to have things living there. So the next step of this is what happens when the soil's wet, and we have this soil down here in this jar. This is that same soil from Rogers Memorial Farm, and it's already wet in these jars. And here's this soil, clod, is in here now. And you can kind of see they're rolling around in here. They're still stable, even though they've been wet for 6 months in this jar. So I just keep reusing them. These are my rain clouds. I'm gonna put some rain on here. An inch of water in this 6-inch cylinder or 5-inch cylinder. And let's just see what happens to water when it interacts with wet soil. So this stability really matters for the soil to continue to function when wet. And that's the power of soil health. As we get a rain event and the soil's wet, then we get a second rain event, we really want that to soak in and benefit from that rain too. But if it's already slaked and we formed a crust, like a gray crust on the soil surface, that's slaking that happens out there in nature, and that crust prevents water from infiltrating. So as we see here, after just a few minutes, the water's still on the soil surface in this jar. And it takes an hour or more for it to soak through this soil, and that's extremely slow. And so soil in nature doesn't exist in a jar, it's on a slope. So when it stands on the soil surface, because it can't infiltrate, then it runs down the hill and goes to the creek, and that carries away topsoil, it carries away nutrients, and all sorts of benefits are lost because we don't soak the water into the soil. So when it's stable, after it's wet, then it can infiltrate water. And that really plays into how water infiltrates in a crop field. So here are the same two soils. They're moist in these cutters. I cut these out of the field. This is the long-term no-till, and this is the long-term till. He actually fall plows this with a moldboard plow still. Then he spring discs it, and then he runs a field cultivation before planting, and then he cultivates mid-season. So 4 tillage events through this field every year for 40 years has resulted in it looking pretty bleak. Not a lot of things living there. This soil, we can't hardly keep it covered. The carbon just disappears every season. You'll notice on this monolith over here, there's way less residue on the soil surface than even on this no-till system. It has a lot more carbon because it's not as full of life. There's not as much life in these two soil profiles as that long-term no-till. So that it has a lot of organisms that are consuming food. So I'm going to put another inch of water on here. This is a 4% slope, really typical slope for Nebraska croplands. This is an exceptional rain event. So it's an inch of water in about 15 seconds. So that's 240 inches per hour. So that's a really crazy rain event on a 6-inch run here. So I'm exceeding its capacity to function. That's the goal with that much water. But as you can see, this one has quite an ability to function. Because it's so stable when it's wet, then water can pass through it so quickly. It's like a sieve. It just runs and runs. You can just dump 5-gallon buckets of water on this, and it's 4 inches per hour infiltration rate. So a 4-inch rain spread over a whole hour of time could soak into this soil. The rain events that we got in 2019 were anywhere between 1.5 inches to 2.5 inches, and that was on some frozen soil. I saw a statistic that frozen soil retains about somewhere between around 25% of its total infiltration rate when it's frozen. So this soil with 4 inches per hour could, when frozen, potentially soak in like 1 inch per hour. That's a substantial decrease, but still able to withstand and handle quite a bit of rain even when frozen. Just because there's air pores and passages that don't freeze solid with water. this soil, because it's slaked, because it's sealed off the surface, because water just won't infiltrate through it, it ran off almost almost all the water I poured on. And you can see how much erosion happened just in that 6-inch run with that bare ground. It's substantial. And so we really can implement some soil health principles. So this chart here is good. So in order to achieve that aggregate stability, we need to just keep the soil covered, maximize soil cover. We can diversify with crop rotations or cover crops. We can provide that continuous living root, and just minimizing disturbance is a soil health principle. And you can implement any of those, half of those, all of them. How intense you get with the soil health management principles really dictates how fast that soil is going to change. But just minimizing disturbance with no-till farming can substantially improve the aggregate stability, and then we stop having runoff because of that sealing of the soil surface. So that's why infiltration rate matters. The soil surface dictates a lot of infiltration rate. That's mainly with sorptivity. The first wetting is impacted by the crust. Beyond that, this crust really seals off the surface, but if there's a crack, water can get down into the soil profile. These layers of really dense soil from compaction from that tillage equipment impact the infiltration rate even more substantially than the surface crust. This really slows down the ability of the soil to function, to soak in that water. But beyond that, there's a disc layer in this one. The scallop is those disc blades from a tandem disc. You can see that curved compaction layer. Right underneath it here is a chalkboard kind of texture. It's really, really heavy soil. And water just stops right there on that 6-inch layer, that horizontal fracture in a soil profile, and it perches above it. So it will look like our field's really moist, but we've only got water in the top 4 to 6 inches, and water just won't move beyond that very often, especially with heavy soils. Oddly enough, our sandy soils have the highest capacity to compact at depth. We can really turn that into a cement chalkboard at about 6 or 8 inches and create a compaction layer that really does impact our infiltration rate in sands. We get a lot of lateral flow in sands, and so you kind of can't see it sometimes with tests, but a lot of times you'll see ponding in a sandy field because of that layer at 6 or 8 inches. And to alleviate that, we grow some roots through it, poke some holes, establish some living channels, and then all of a sudden our whole profile starts to function. We can really achieve great things with sandy soil, really productive soil as well. So with that, I think, yeah, perfect. We would like you to take an opportunity to pound a ring in. You can pound in 1 or 2 and do a comparison. You can just go out here to the crop field and try 1 if you want. We're going to pour some water in these. You can just take that off. It's just a nuisance. If you want to grab that other ring that doesn't have measurements, or that other cylinder, pour that in there. So come up here, grab a pile of these tools, and we can walk over here and I can show you how to set one up, and then we can split up and do this infiltration rate. This infiltration machine, it takes water in, it gauges how fast the water is flowing, and it keeps a constant flow rate, and it does multiple runs. So it'll go clear through a cycle, test the flow rate, achieve that equilibrium, and then shut off, and then it starts over again and does it again. What it does is it achieves moist soil. When the soil's saturated, that's really when water starts to flow at its slowest through the soil profile, and we really want to know that saturated conductivity, the ability of the soil to flow water when wet. So we achieve wet soil, and then it keeps that constant pressure on the system so that it knows that there's not a change in the height of the water in that ring that would influence the rate. And then it measures the flow, how often it needs to recharge based on the change in pressure. Then that's how it calculates the infiltration rate. We go across the state and do these in-depth studies with the group of 5 of them, and then we have some statistical confidence in the infiltration rate now that is superior to about anything I could attempt. So I'll take your tools here. But it's got its own timer. Right now it's got 66 minutes left. And so it just runs, it's automatic, it does its own deal. I just come back when I hear it shut off.
But are they all, I mean, is it all the same timer?
Yeah, so we base it off the soil texture and how moist the soil is and how deep I pounded that ring in. This is a 10 centimeter ring instead of a 5 centimeter. And then the pressure that we want and how many runs we want all dictate the total time. So it's a little recipe that we use a book to set up based on where we're at in the world and what it's like that day. So that's a great question. Thank you. So what I try and do when I'm looking for a single ring infiltration rate, this is a single ring. There's double rings. You can pound in a big ring and then a little ring in the center, and you can put water in the outer ring and keep it moist. That's a crazy setup. We've never had one of those. So then I just pick some of the plants from the area that I identify. I want to find something that's not a tire track. That's my goal in a crop field. Our tire traffic can exceed 3/4 of the field, but we're hoping on hope that you keep your tire traffic to less than 50% of the total field. That way, when we're measuring infiltration rate in a non-tire traffic row, that should represent more than half of the field. That's the goal. You can achieve about 1/3 is the least tire traffic you can achieve in a controlled traffic system. That's pretty difficult to achieve, so 50% is a really good goal. And then when we compare tire traffic rows to non-tire traffic rows on Rogers Memorial Farm, for example, and it's pretty true, it's about this much different. The non-tire traffic row was 4 inches per hour, like I said. The tire traffic row is 0.4 inches per hour. So 10 times less infiltration rate in a tire traffic row than where it's not been compacted by tire traffic. That's pretty amazing, and it's worth your time to restrict your tire traffic, because then we can have that soil function at that higher level. So I try and remove a little bit of debris like this. I find a little spot that's level. You can be on a hill slope and still find a 6-inch area that's flat. Those little micro topography areas are the key. I don't like to find loose soil. I don't want debris or duff or unnatural soil. I go down to the soil surface. So out here you'll see there's a little bit of soil that's been thrown up from the planting system or something. I try and avoid that and just find this natural soil surface to pound this ring into. So kind of cut through the residue here, get it level. Somebody have oh, I just took it from you, thank you. So these wood blocks, that other one had a little wood block, so hopefully we can share or figure out how to distribute that. And then you just pound it about halfway. Make sure it's still level. Then I kind of take my fingers on the inside and just really lightly make sure that the soil is touching the ring. That's the key. I'm not trying to compact it. I just don't want preferential flow right along the inside of that ring. And then if you got that water, so you've got the timer. 444 milliliters is an inch of water in a 6-inch ring. It's just the math. You can do that for any size ring. Just figure out how much equals an inch of volume. And so you can put saran wrap. The book would say put saran wrap in here, pour the water in, and then slip the saran wrap out. We're trying to be accurate, not precise. So we really want accuracy. So we try and get all the water in. But we're not trying to be precise in the sense that we need to start the time the instant this water touches the soil. That would be much more precise. So that's the real difference here. You'll see that this single ring infiltration rate only offers accuracy by the time you're done. To achieve precision, you have to have 5 or more of these rings, and to increase your confidence level, because it's just got a lot of variability. So I use my hand as a shield and just kind of pour the water in. My goal is to not disturb the soil surface with that water flow. I don't want the water to get muddy. I just want it to still be clear when I'm done. And so you started the timer, and that's a wrap. That's how easy it is. It should take you just a minute or two to get set up, and then you just stand and watch the paint dry. It's really that simple. I just take note, I'll write down my clock time on this one, and then I'll go to do a second one and write down the clock time on that one as well. And then you can keep 2 running at once. We'll do 10, 12 at once if we need to, and it's pretty accomplishable. And this number really it's a rapid assessment. It can tell you immediately how well this soil is functioning, because water and air trade places. That's how water infiltrates. We need air to come out and we need water to go in. And if air can't move out, then the rate is exceptionally slow. It's actually the wicking rate of water. 0.4 inches per hour is the wick rate. It actually draws the water in because of the matrix, not because of flow. So it's moving pretty fast here, which would be expected for a sand. But I would expect sand to be able to achieve, I've seen sandy soils achieve 36 inches per hour if it's stable when wet and got good residue cover. But this is going to be pretty fast. We're already to like a minute or so.
Minute 40.
So 2 would be 30 inches per hour. You know, so you can start to do the mental math in your head. We put an inch of water on, and if it takes 2 minutes, then that's 30 inches per hour. If it takes 5 minutes, then that's 12 inches per hour, and on and on. So that's how that works. I'd really like you all to spread out, find a spot in the world to test the infiltration, and we'll kind of pair up with you as NRCS folks and help you figure out the details if you have questions.